Her gaze was never the problem. It was the way she held the silence between a compliment and a lie. He watched her like someone trying to decipher a lost language, even knowing that, by the end of the translation, the heart would be the only thing mutilated. She smiled as if she carried no secrets, but there was something on her lips that gave away what her eyes still insisted on denying. In the empty room, her dress fluttered in the wind from the balcony, while the man in front of her no longer knew whether he admired the woman he loved or the trap waiting for him. The mansion was large enough to hide anything, including uncomfortable truths. He had grown up there, among marble columns and silent dinners, but he never knew for sure who his real enemy was, the world outside or his own family. From an early age, he learned that heirs are not loved, they are contested. And among disputes, love becomes a scarce, fragile, often fabricated commodity. When she appeared, it was like light slipping through the crack of a vault, but now he no longer knew if that light illuminated or blinded. She met him as an ordinary man. He never mentioned his last name, nor the fortune carried in his lineage. And for a time, he thought that was enough for the connection between them to be real. Pretending to be less was the only way to see who approached him out of affection, and not for wealth. But his brother, the one the world saw as a bastard and irrelevant, never had to pretend anything. He was himself in all his wounded arrogance, in all his hunger for validation. And that was why she fell so easily for his charm, because what is simple and sincere often frightens those used to false mirrors. That her first kiss was given like a promise that needed no words. But when the second kiss came, and it wasn't with him, the promise shattered like crystal. She thought she was living a typical love triangle, a confusion of hearts and desires. But what she didn't know was that the game she entered was older, crueler, and costlier than any romance ever told. And in that game, the loser wasn't just the one who lost love. It was the one who lost themselves. The hallways of the house witnessed whispered conversations, stolen touches, and decisions that could never be undone. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It was the choice for a louder sparkle, for more theatrical attention, for a hungrier ego. She didn't just betray the man who loved her, she betrayed herself. Because even without knowing, she had become a piece on a chessboard where the brothers shared not only blood, but the right to exist. In the backyard garden, where the roses always seemed redder than they should be, she swore she was in love with the wrong man. Not out of malice, but out of ignorance. For not knowing who was who. For not suspecting that the true heir never flaunted himself, never imposed. He simply observed. And it was precisely in silence that he planned what to do when everything came to light, because it would. Every lie has an expiration date. And so does love. She wondered why he, the first one, had withdrawn without explanation. She didn't know that he had seen, not the kiss, but the look. The hesitation, the poorly hidden desire. Sometimes, betrayal begins before the touch. It starts when the heart vibrates in the wrong direction, and he felt it, like a blade pressing against his chest, not cutting, just warning, this will hurt later, and it did. But he didn't flee, he simply stepped back. Because some wars require strategy, not bravery. The brother, on the other hand, never hid his intentions. He wanted everything that wasn't his. And he knew that the only way to gain ground in that family was by making noise. Stealing his brother's love was more than a victory. It was revenge for the life he never had, and deep down, he used her too. But she, blinded by attention, confused thirst with love. And it's always like that. When the ego speaks louder, the heart follows without question. The housekeeper, who had watched generations crumble from the inside for decades, tried to warn them. But no one listens to those who aren't part of the main narrative. She saw the same mistakes repeating in new faces and understood that what was lacking wasn't love, it was memory. Everyone forgets that those who love in silence see everything. And when they decide to act, they don't warn. They simply do. While she smiled beside the brother, believing she was living a new chapter of life, the true heir was signing documents, closing accounts, and preparing his absence. He didn't scream, didn't confront, didn't beg. He simply vanished. Because true love does not compete, it liberates. And if she didn't know how to distinguish love from competition, then maybe she was never worthy of either. The photos on her phone showed the two of them on trips, at dinners, parties. But the absence of light in her eyes was visible to anyone who had seen the original glow. She smiled with her lips, but the emptiness behind her eyes gave it away. She didn't know who she was with. She believed she had won. But she didn't even know the name of the game. The true heir, now far away, remembered the conversations on the porch, the plans they made in secret, the promises whispered in the dark. He remembered because it still hurt. And for that reason, he didn't come back. Because returning would mean admitting there was still hope. And hope is the worst poison when you already know the taste of disappointment. She began to sense something was wrong when the messages stopped coming, when the gifts stopped arriving, when the places where she used to be looked at with adoration now delivered only silence. And it was in the silence that the truth began to whisper. Not through words, but through absence. Because absence speaks too, and it screams. He, in another continent, was now the majority shareholder of everything she knew, but he didn't want to show it, didn't want to prove anything. He wanted to forget, but forgetting someone new. Love is like trying to put out a fire with your own hands. You pretend to be in control, but you keep burning inside. The brother, seizing the momentary spotlight, began to show his true face. Less patience, less gentleness, more demands, more coldness, she noticed, but thought it was a phase. It wasn't, it was essence. And essence doesn't change, it only reveals itself with time. She tried to reach out, sent messages, tried to arrange a meeting. He saw them, but didn't reply. Because sometimes the loudest scream is silence, and sometimes the deepest punishment is absence. She felt it, but didn't understand. Not yet. The father, now ill, called the true son for one last conversation. No inheritance, no demands. Just to ask forgiveness for a life of tests and omissions. He listened, but didn't reply. Because there are pains only time can translate. And some apologies aren't meant to be accepted, only to ease dying consciences. The mother, absent by choice or fear, never knew what happened behind the scenes. But she prayed every night for reconciliation. She didn't know the bridge had already been burned, and that what remained now was ashes, scattered by the wind of poor decisions. She, at home, in front of the mirror, finally began to see herself, without the filters of passion. She saw the choices. She saw the signs she ignored. She saw herself for who she was, someone who confused presence with love and attention with truth. She cried, but crying doesn't heal. It only cleans what is already broken. On the 1-year anniversary of his disappearance, she went to the place where they first met, hoping to find him. But all she found was her own reflection in a storefront window. And for the first time, she asked herself, if I were in his place, would I have stayed? The pain of doubt is crueler than the pain of loss. Because while loss has an end, doubt recycles, is reborn, and resurfaces. And she knew he still existed somewhere, but maybe no longer for her. The brother, without her light, began to lose his own shine too. Because some men only shine by the reflection of others. And when her light went out, he became shadow too. The family, with more money than sense, continued, pretending everything was fine. But the dinners returned to being silent, and the hallways echoed with the same old ghosts. She now had everything, except the truth. And sometimes, truth is all that's left. The phone rang only once. She answered, but no one spoke. only the sound of a piano in the background. It was him, she knew. Because some melodies have an owner. And then regret didn't. Knock on the door. It broke it down, but it was already too late. The sound of the piano wasn't a coincidence. It was a coded message, a reminder that memories can't be buried beneath the dust of pride. He knew she would understand, because that piano had been the first secret shared between them, back in the days when she believed she was falling in love with an ordinary man. Each note carried a memory, a conversation cut short, a laugh that only ever existed between the two of them. And now, in the middle of the silent call, that was all that remained. The memory of a time when eyes said more than words. The city felt colder, even with the sun reflecting off the mirrored buildings. She walked the streets like someone searching for something they lost but didn't have the courage to name. That sound stirred something inside her, not because it was grand, but because it was intimate. A subtle touch on the wound she had been trying to cover up with routine, makeup, and excuses. But some pains move inside even in silence, and those piano keys played more than notes. They touched her conscience. He watched from afar. Not as a guardian, but as someone witnessing the final scene of a film he had chosen not to act in anymore. He was different. Thinner, more restrained. His eyes no longer sparkled with innocence, and his smile no longer appeared easily. He still loved her, of that he was certain. But love, to him now, was like a scar, visible but insensitive to touch. It was there, but it no longer hurt like before. And perhaps because of that, it was more dangerous. Because when love doesn't hurt, it becomes cold, and coldness thinks more clearly. The brother, even without knowing about the silent call, began to notice that something in her had changed. The way she dressed, the way she went quiet, the way she stared out the window. He knew that kind of absence. It wasn't tiredness, it was regret. He tried to compensate with gifts, trips, luxurious nights. But the more he tried, the more he realized that what he was offering was just fake gold in shiny wrapping. She had already seen real gold, and now everything else felt like emotional costume jewelry. She tried to revisit the places where they had been happy. Hidden cafes, small bookstores, trails and parks only they knew. She was looking for something to reconnect her to a feeling that had died. But revisiting places doesn't resurrect feelings. And she discovered that what she was seeking wasn't a moment. It was the man who had made those moments special. And that man was no longer there, neither in space nor in time, nor in her. The memory of seeing him for the first time hit her like a punch to the stomach. He was wearing an old coat, leaning against the side of the company building, holding a book she loved. They talked for half an hour, and she thought it was chance, but he had planned it. He knew who she was. He wanted to know who she could be, without knowing who he was. And that's why he never revealed his full name. Because some names come with weight, and he wanted to be light. The brother, on the other hand, approached her at a moment of vulnerability. He was the shoulder, the comfort, the invitation to forget. And she, weakened by the absence of the first, gave herself to the second. She thought she was starting over. But in truth, she was just filling one emptiness with another. And now, all she felt was an echo, a feeling screaming in an empty room. Their father, increasingly distant from the company's control, watched the drama unfold with a mixture of guilt and irony. He had always known that putting two sons to silently compete for space was a slow poison, but he chose not to intervene. He thought time would fix it, but time doesn't heal what silence feeds. And now, the heir he respected most was gone. And what remained on the throne was just vanity in an expensive suit. The company's stock began to fluctuate. Nothing drastic, but enough to worry those who understand signals. And he, the true heir, watched it all. Not to intervene, but to see how far it would go. He knew the brother wasn't prepared to keep it standing, and that the collapse wouldn't be the market's fault, but the result of choices. And maybe, when everything crumbled, she would finally understand that she had chosen glitter over structure. Her relationship with the brother began to unravel in small absences. First, the touches decreased, then the compliments, then the gaze. He no longer made an effort to hide his boredom, and she could no longer pretend not to notice. She tried to start conversations, plan dinners, but everything felt artificial, as if they were acting out a relationship for an invisible audience. And the worst loneliness is the one you feel beside someone. Her friends noticed, but they didn't say anything, because they knew any comment would sound like, "I told you so," and no one likes to hear that. So she carried everything alone: the doubts, the burdens, the silences, and worst of all, the comparison. Because she had already known a different kind of love. A love that listened, that looked into her eyes, that didn't need introductions or status. That he, in turn, was gradually finding some balance. He had new projects, solid partnerships, quiet travels, but at night, he still thought about her. Not with anger, but with that resigned melancholy of someone who understands that not all love lasts, but all true love leaves marks. And he was full of marks, some that hurt, others that taught. She began writing letters, not to send, but to vent. Pages and pages with phrases she never said, with apologies she never voiced. She kept everything in a box, as if one day she would have the courage to deliver them. But deep down, she knew she wouldn't write forever. Because pain, eventually, either transforms or destroys. The brother found one of the letters, read it in secret, and for a moment, felt a pain he didn't recognize. It wasn't jealousy. It was fear. Fear that she was emotionally returning to someone he had never managed to be. And that fear turned into anger. And the anger turned into control. He began to want to decide everything, from what she wore to whom she talked to, but it was too late. Because when someone starts to fade on the inside, no amount of watchfulness brings them back. She tried to talk, explain, but he didn't listen. He yelled, accused, called her ungrateful, said he had saved her from abandonment. But she, with firm eyes, replied, "You just kept me busy so I wouldn't notice what I'd lost." And when he heard that, he understood he had lost too. But didn't know when. Maybe since the beginning, the father had a mild heart attack. Nothing serious, but enough to bring the two brothers together for the first time in months. She was present, and the atmosphere was so heavy the nurses could feel it. The true heir arrived, calm, well-dressed, without arrogance. The brother, seeing him, felt the ground shake. And she, seeing him, felt everything shake. The encounter was brief. Eyes met. No words. But those who understand feelings know, sometimes silence is the deepest dialogue. And in that instant, she knew she still loved him. And he knew he still felt her, but neither of them moved. Because pride, when it becomes armor, weighs more than any love. From the hospital bed, the father asked the two of them to stay, to talk, to resolve things, but they just exchanged nods and left. Because some pains aren't solved by willpower. They're solved by courage. And at that moment, neither of them had it. She spent the night thinking about what she would do if she had another chance. And he spent the night trying not to think. Because thinking about possibilities that don't come true is torture disguised as hope. And he no longer had the strength to bleed again. The brother, now more insecure than ever, began sabotaging meetings, pushing away partners, and making impulsive decisions, all to show control. But those who need to prove something all the time are always one step away from collapse. And the empire began to crack. She dreamed about the first kiss. That old kiss, forgotten, but still alive. And she woke up with teary eyes, because sometimes the body remembers what the mind tries to erase. And on that day, she realized she needed to do something, not for him, But for herself, by late morning, she went to the building where he now worked. No one recognized her. She didn't ask to go in. She left a letter with the secretary, the same letter she had written months before, with all the words that pride had prevented her from saying, and she left. He received it, read it, laughed, cried, and kept it. He didn't reply, because he still didn't know what to say. But he knew that, for the first time, she had understood everything. And that was a beginning. Or perhaps an ending, but at least it was the truth. The paper between his fingers trembled more than his voice, even though on the outside everything still appeared controlled. Her letter was not a plea nor a justification. It was a bare request, stripped of vanity, written by someone who had finally stopped competing with the truth. And that disarmed him in a way he didn't expect. Because the love that bleeds and the love that matures are not always the same, but sometimes they are born from the same wound. The words echoed like muted bells through the corridors of his mind. There were no rehearsed phrases, no attempts at persuasion. It was simply a portrait of guilt, pain, and lucidity. And that shook him. Because she didn't try to defend herself. She simply exposed her emotional bankruptcy, like someone who acknowledges a defeat without applause. And when someone surrenders without a shield, the other must decide whether to embrace or turn away forever. The box where he had kept memories for years was locked behind a shelf in his new apartment. Inside, newspaper clippings, a photo torn in half, a necklace she had forgotten in a cafe, and a postcard never sent. Everything in there said more about him than any resume ever could. And when he placed her letter inside that box, he wasn't discarding it. He was archiving it. Like someone admitting the story wasn't over yet, but needed time to turn the page without tearing it. The company that once carried the family name was now the target of emergency meetings and rumors among investors. The board began to split, and some names quietly began to seek out the rightful heir. Not because they regretted the past, but because they saw instability growing. And in the world of business, feelings matter less than results. And the results were collapsing along with the facade of power the brother still tried to maintain. She found out through the newspapers that his name was circulating again. But not as a shadow, as a possibility. And that made her restless. Not out of ambition, but out of hope. Hope that maybe she could still see him again without being rejected by his eyes. Because words hurt, but when the gaze denies, it wounds at a frequency that echoes inside. The brother watched her from a distance, like someone who senses the center of the stage slipping through his fingers. He tried to force meetings, memories, intimacy, but everything felt hollow. Because she no longer smiled spontaneously. She smiled out of politeness. She no longer cried in secret. She cried in silence, even in front of him. And that coldness hurt more than any scream. Because what is frozen doesn't shatter, it paralyzes. The arguments became frequent. Harsh words, old accusations, demands about the past. He constantly reminded her of what she had done, but she no longer defended herself. She just listened, not because she agreed, but out of exhaustion. Because sometimes, pain no longer wants to fight, it just wants peace. And peace, in that relationship, was an extinct concept. The true heir, now more present in discreet meetings, refused all proposals to return. Not out of arrogance, but because he knew that returning too soon was emotional suicide. He was still rebuilding himself, still bleeding in places no one could see. And leading with open wounds only spreads blood in decisions that require precision. The partners tried to manage the situation with public statements, promises, and fake smiles at conferences. But the market is not convinced by appearances. It demands substance. And the substance there had been replaced by vanity, pride, and reckless decisions. And in the midst of it all, she remained beside someone who blamed her for the collapse he himself had built. Their reunion wasn't planned. It happened at a corporate event, in a hotel with minimalist architecture and people in suits more expensive than their truths. She saw him first. He looked more mature, more composed, more distant. He saw her next, but didn't look away. He held the gaze for long seconds, like someone saying everything that won't fit in a sentence. And in that tense silence, the whole story wanted to begin again, but stayed frozen in time. He was polite, courteous, but cold. And that combination destroyed any expectation she still secretly held. She asked how he was. He said, different. And that was enough. Because when someone says they're different, they're saying they no longer fit where they once existed, and she understood. Because she no longer recognized herself either. During the conference, he gave a speech. Spoke about legacy, ethics, memory, and principles. He mentioned no names, but she felt herself inside every word. And the brother, sitting beside her, knew it was a warning, not an attack, but a marking of emotional territory. The story was being repositioned, and anyone who wanted to remain would have to reorganize. At the dinner that followed, she tried to approach. Not with words, but with presence. She sat at the same table, waited for the right moment. When he got up to leave, she followed him, not with haste, but with precision. And in the hallway, she called his name. He stopped, turned, but didn't smile. He just waited. And she, trembling inside, simply said, "I'm sorry for everything I didn't understand before." He looked at her with a beautiful weariness, a kind of gaze that says, "I know," without needing to say it. He didn't respond. He simply reached into his pocket, took out a small old keychain, and handed it to her. It was the keychain he had dropped at their first meeting. She had kept it ever since. Returning it now was more than a gesture. It was a silent signature of closure. She cried when he walked away, but didn't run after him, because she understood that her pain no longer moved him, and that was both liberating and cruel. He had forgiven her, but he no longer wanted to try. And she respected that, because love is also knowing when to stop. Walking alone. The following days were of retreat for both. He resumed his position in the company, not as a savior, but as someone who knew what needed to be done. No fanfare, no speeches, just work. Because some reconquests don't need a stage, only consistency. And she now began to rebuild herself with bricks of truth. No more pretending. No more distractions. The brother lost roles, respect, and control. He tried to blame her again. Said she was the weak link, the emotional traitor. But she no longer reacted, because it was no longer about him. It was about her. And she had understood that loving someone is not enough. You have to know how she left the house where they had lived together. Took only books, clothes, and that box with the letters that were never sent. Rented a small apartment facing a park. Started working in education. Not for survival, but for redemption. She wanted to teach. She wanted to listen. She wanted perhaps to give back to the world the listening she had never received. He found out through a mutual colleague. Smiled at the thought of her surrounded by children with less tired eyes. He didn't try to contact her, but felt something inside him realigning. Because when someone you loved starts to blossom without you, the pain that comes is strange. It's longing and pride mixed in a capsule hard to swallow. One day, she wrote one last letter. Not for him, but for herself. A closing letter. Thanking the woman she was, the one who got lost, and the one she was becoming. She placed it in an envelope, tucked it inside a book they used to read together, and left it on the shelf. At the end of the week, she was surprised by an anonymous delivery. A leather-bound notebook with the words, "If one day you want to start again." Handwritten on the cover, no signature, but she recognized the handwriting. And there, among blank pages, perhaps there was a new chance. But this time, no promises. No rush, no illusions. She sat at the table, opened the first page, and took a deep breath. She didn't know if he wanted to come back, but she knew that, if he did, he would find in her a different woman. And that was enough, for him, and for her. The notebook remained on the table for days. She glanced at it, as if afraid to profane something sacred by touching it before the right time. She didn't know if that object was a refined goodbye or a silent invitation. But there was something in the hand-engraved letters that held her, as if they were a password to a future that didn't yet exist. She hesitated, not from lack of will, but from excess of memory. Because sometimes, opening a new page takes more courage than closing an entire chapter. During that time, he hesitated too. The delivery hadn't been impulsive. He thought about it for weeks. He wanted to build a bridge without asking for passage. A gesture that said, "The door is there, only come in if you want to." Because after everything they lived through, any attempt at reconnection needed to be free. No emotional blackmail, no implied debt. He was no longer the man who wrote love letters in the silence of the night. But he was still someone capable of remembering every detail, even while pretending to forget. She finally opened the notebook. The first page was blank, but there were light marks on the paper, as if someone had written something and then erased it. And that hurt more than any sentence. Because what is erased doesn't disappear, it only hides. As she flipped through, she found an envelope glued between the middle pages. Inside, a short note with just 7 words. Not everything needs to restart to stay alive. She reread the phrase like someone deciphering a riddle. She understood that not all stories need to return to be complete. That there are loves that change shape, but not essence. And that maybe what remained between them was no longer a romance, but a kind of invisible pact between two souls that had touched too deeply to ever fully forget. It was like a song that, even when it ends, keeps echoing in the ears of memory. He, meanwhile, was returning more and more to the center of decisions in the company. But his gaze was different, less ambitious, more human. He had realized that the hardest legacy to leave is not financial, it's emotional. And the worst kind of bankruptcy a person can face is not in business, but in affection. He now made a point of listening to those who were once ignored, of valuing what was once invisible. Because power that doesn't transform into empathy turns into arrogance. Gradually, people who once feared him began to truly admire him. And that didn't come from inspiring speeches, but from silent gestures. A phone call to a forgotten employee, a deserved promotion without spotlights, a discreet visit to the old housekeeper who was now sick and forgotten by the family. He understood more than ever that greatness lives in the backstage, and that to love is also to manage well what no one sees. She began writing in the notebook, not for him, but for herself. She placed there pieces of memories, scattered phrases that reminded her of good and bad moments. She didn't expect an answer. It was an exercise in reconstruction. Each word written was a brick placed where once there were only emotional ruins. And in that silent ritual, something inside her began to settle. As if, for the first time in a long while, she was at peace with the past. The brother, now isolated within the company and his own guilt, began to realize that his downfall wasn't caused by others, but by himself. He tried to regain respect with theatrical gestures, but no one believed in his performance anymore. What remained was a lonely man, drowned in defeated vanity and incapable of truly apologizing. Because for some, pride is the last armor, and also the first prison. She met him by chance in a coffee shop. He looked more worn out, less secure, with eyes that once seemed to dominate the world now fixed on the ground. He tried to start a conversation, but she just smiled politely and said, "Some wounds don't heal with words, but with silence." And she left, not with anger, but with relief. Because that encounter wasn't a return, it was a full stop. Days later, he received back the same notebook he had sent, but now with dozens of handwritten pages. There was no note, no dedication, just a blue ribbon tied around the middle. He understood. It was her way of saying, "You don't need to respond, just read and keep." And that's what he did. He read for hours in silence, and he cried. Because each phrase was a mirror, and each mirror showed what still hurt. He looked for her after that, not with flowers, not with promises, but with an invitation to take a walk. Just that, no specific destination, and she accepted. The two of them walked for minutes without saying anything. And it was the most comfortable silence they had ever shared. Because sometimes, the love that matures doesn't need explanation, only presence. During that walk, they talked about everything except the past. They laughed about light things, shared silly memories, asked questions without urgency. It was as if they were building a new story using what was left of the old one, without hurry, without fear, without illusions. Just two people who had been broken and glued their pieces back together with time, pain, and learning. The following week, she invited him to see the educational project she had been developing. He remained silent during the presentation, but his eyes said everything: pride, admiration, respect. For the first time, he saw her not as the woman who hurt him, but as the woman who rebuilt herself. And that was stronger than any attraction. It was a kind of silent reverence. At the end of the event, he hugged her. Not a romantic hug, but a hug of recognition. Like someone saying, "I see you, I understand you, I forgive you." And she cried, but not out of sadness. She cried for having survived her own mistake, for having rebuilt an inner place where forgiveness fit, including forgiveness of herself. They continued seeing each other, without labels, but frequently. Sometimes they had dinner together. Other times, they just walked in silence. They didn't plan the future, didn't revisit the past. They were simply there, for each other, like two survivors who know that love, when it survives everything, becomes something else. Something calmer, deeper, more solid. Time passed. They both changed. The company stabilized. The noises of the old story became background noise, and the main melody now consisted of small daily notes. A coffee left at the door, a call at the end of the day, a recommended book, a note in a coat pocket. Things that only make sense to those who no longer need to prove anything. One day, during a lecture, he was asked about regrets. He paused for a few seconds and replied, "Just one. Having taken so long to understand that to love is not to possess, it's to embrace." The audience applauded, but she, who was among the listeners, just smiled with full eyes. Because she knew that phrase was for her. At the exit, he was waiting with a book in his hands. It was the same one he held the day they met. On the cover, a dedication: "If one day everything fades, let this remind us where we came from." She read it in silence and replied with a kiss on his cheek. A kiss that said, "Yes, I remember. And I'm still here." That night, he took her to the balcony of an old hotel they had visited years ago. The same place where she kissed him for the last time before everything fell apart. There, with no audience, no promises, he asked, "If I weren't who I am today, would you still choose me?" She answered without hesitation, "If you were still who you were, I wouldn't have learned to love you as you are now." Her answer dismantled his defenses. Because it wasn't an attempt to revive what was, it was a recognition of who he had become. And in that instant, he understood that what united them now was stronger than what had once separated them. They didn't make anything official, didn't take pictures, didn't post declarations, but they began to be part of each other's lives naturally, like someone returning home after a long journey, with less anxiety, more wisdom, with less urgency, more truth. And so they went on, not like before, but as they should have been from the beginning. Their reunion was no longer a surprise to those who knew them from a distance. But there was something in the way they looked at each other that revealed a story never forgotten. They weren't together like a traditional couple, but they weren't apart like strangers either. What existed between them was a kind of silent pact, where the past had left scars, but not walls. They walked side by side as those who carry a rare kind of tenderness, the kind that survived the storm. She watched him in the small gestures. The way he held the cup, how he ran his finger along the rim of the glass without noticing, how he furrowed his brow when reading bad news. These were signs no one else noticed, but to her, they meant everything. What was once desire was now presence. A kind of mature, silent affection with no urgency to possess. And it was in this wordless affection that she found the peace she never had with the other. He, in turn, began including her name in small corners of his life. Not as a rehearsed return, but as a sincere acknowledgement. She appeared in informal meetings, in social projects, in dinners with close people. He didn't explain, didn't label, just let her presence speak for itself. And those who saw it understood. There was a story there that had overcome something invisible, and for that reason alone, it was stronger than any formality. The brother, increasingly absent from the public eye, tried to find space elsewhere. He invested in side businesses, traveled far, sought visibility in events that had nothing to do with his essence. But the emptiness that followed him couldn't be filled with appearances. He still carried the weight of comparison, the silent rejection he had endured all his life. And deep down, he knew that the woman who had been by his side never truly loved him. She had only confused him with the other. She started writing a book. Not about them, but about rebuilding. It was a personal account disguised as fiction, where invented characters lived oddly familiar situations. She wrote slowly, between one class and another, as someone who needed to organize her soul before showing it to the world, and he heard about it from others. He didn't ask, didn't insist on reading. He simply bought a new notebook and wrote on the back cover, "When you're ready, this space is yours." The children at the school where she taught began calling her Auntie Smile, and that moved her more than any title. Because in that simple environment, without the social masks that once suffocated her, she felt useful, that she made a difference, that she was seen for who she truly was. And every time she saw a child's eyes light up because of something she taught, she remembered how much she had longed to be looked at that way by someone in the past. A new partner approached the company, an international investor interested in fusing values and innovation. During a meeting, he asked directly, "What's the human differential of your leadership?" And the true heir replied without hesitation, "I lost what was most precious to me and came back. But I could only return because I learned to see people beyond what they do. Today, I know that a good leader doesn't command, they care." She heard that response later through the recording of the conference, and she cried quietly on the living room couch. Not because of the indirect compliment, but because she finally understood that the man she had hurt not only forgave her, he had turned her into part of his vision of the world. And to be seen that way was a gift that couldn't be bought or asked for. It was something one received by becoming worthy again. At a charity event, they were invited to share their stories of overcoming. She hesitated. She didn't want to expose herself. But he said, "Don't talk about us. Talk about yourself." And she went on stage. She spoke about failures, losses, rebuilding. She used no names, no dates, no shields, only truths. And when she stepped down, she was embraced by a group of women who said, "You spoke for me." That day, she realized that true love teaches us to serve, not to show off. He watched everything from the side of the stage. With moist eyes and a steady chest, it wasn't pride, it was reverence. For her strength, for her courage to expose her own fragility with dignity. And there he understood, without anyone needing to say it, that the love that remains isn't the one that screams, "Stay with me," but the one that whispers, I see you, even when no one else does. She began visiting the old mansion's housekeeper regularly. She brought flowers, blankets, books in Braille. They talked for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes laughing. The elderly lady would say, "You came back better than when you arrived," and that touched her more than any apology. Because knowing that someone who witnessed her fall now recognized her rise was proof that not every mistake ends in ruin. The brother, now living in another city, sent an email. Without guilt, without venom, with just one line, "If you can, forgive me for everything." She read it, replied simply, "Already forgiven," and never touched on it again. Because some stories don't need to be retold to be closed. They just need a silent full stop. A young employee at the company approached the heir. He said he was going through family drama and asked for advice. He listened for hours. In the end, he said, "What destroys a home isn't the mistake, it's the pride of not fixing it." And those words came with the weight of someone who had lived it. The young man thanked him and left with teary eyes. From that moment on, the internal culture of the company began to change. She went back to drawing, an old habit she had abandoned. During years of emotional confusion, now between classes, she sketched portraits, landscapes, loose traces of happy memories. One day, without knowing, he found one of her drawings at an anonymous exhibition. He recognized it instantly, bought the piece and placed it in his office. Below the frame, he wrote, "What is true always finds its way back." They kept walking together, but now along their own paths. They didn't depend on each other, they simply chose to be. And that daily choice was stronger than any contract. Because when love stops being an obligation and becomes a decision, it matures. And nothing is safer than loving with awareness. The press tried to create stories about them. Rumors, speculation, sensationalist headlines. But none of them were accurate. Because what they had was too subtle to fit into shallow words. And both had learned to protect what had taken so long to rebuild. They knew that not all love needs to be displayed. Some just need to be lived with respect. During a trip to the city where it all began, they visited the old building where they met. It was under renovation, but it was still possible to see traces of their story in its structure. They stopped on the sidewalk, smiled in silence, and she said, "Maybe everything started wrong, so it could end right." He didn't answer. He just held her hand. And in that touch were more promises than any ring could hold. They kept writing, not to each other, but each their own version of the story. And although the narratives were different, both ended the same way, with a sentence that crossed time. And Scar, we only understand the value of what we have when we almost lose it forever. And that's why they kept going, not because they forgot, but because they learned to remember without pain. That night was different from all the others, not because of the absence of noise, but because of the intensity of the silence between them. Sitting side by side on an ordinary park bench, they shared the same air, the same space, and the same certainty. Time had not been kind, but it had been fair. Because only time can separate what is fragile from what is true. And in that moment, there was no doubt. What remained between them was the purest part of what they had once been. He opened an old envelope and handed her a letter he had written years earlier but never had the courage to send. It was a letter full of anger, pain, and bitter words that no longer made sense. But he gave it as proof that all of it had been overcome. Because sometimes showing the scar is the only way to say, "I no longer bleed from this dot." She read it in silence, her heart tight, not because of past pain, but because of how far they had come to arrive there. She kept the letter as someone who stores a record of who they once were. And she said softly, "Thank you for showing me how far pain can take us, and how far truth can bring us back." He smiled, a smile full of maturity. There was no longer the weight of urgency in their words, or the desperation of old times. There was presence. And in such noisy times, to be fully present with someone in peace was a rare privilege. They weren't celebrating a happy ending, they were honoring a conscious restart. The following week, she officially delivered the manuscript of her book to the publisher. The title, The Other Side of the Mirror, a direct reference to everything she had lived through, to everything she had failed to see when she was in love with illusions. And more than that, it was a tribute to the one who taught her to see herself with her own eyes, not through the eyes of others. He was invited to write the preface, and although reluctant, he agreed. His text began like this: "Not all great loves end with kisses. Some end with understanding, others with distance, the best with respect." And he closed with the sentence, "If I had to lose everything, again just to learn what I learned from you, I would." The publication was an unexpected success. But more than sales, she received letters. From women, from men, from young people, from the elderly, all saying the same thing: "You wrote my story." And that touched her deeply, because somehow that pain had not been in vain. It had served to give voice to other silences. They remained close, but they never announced anything. Some people asked, suggested, speculated, but they just smiled, because what belonged to them didn't need to be explained. That kind of bond doesn't live off answers, it lives off complicity. One day, sitting in a small cafe, she asked him, "If everything had been different, would you have loved me the same way?" He took a while to answer, then said, "If everything had been different, maybe we'd never have truly found each other." And she understood. Sometimes pain is the path, not the detour. He gave her an old pocket watch, restored with the inscription, "Anything that survives time deserves to stay." She wore it around her neck, not as an ornament, but as a reminder of what they chose to preserve. And each time she touched that object, she remembered that love doesn't need to rush, it only needs to endure. Their story was once told by a journalist who tried to turn it into a public romance. But none of her words came close to capturing what truly existed between them. Because the real plot wasn't in the facts, it was in the silences, in the looks, in the pauses. And only those who lived it would understand. She began giving talks at public schools, sharing her experience as a way to encourage young people to rebuild themselves after pain. She would say, "You are not the mistake you made, you are what you choose to do after it." And that phrase spread like hope through broken lives. He founded a Human Development Institute. He named the project after the nickname she used to call him during the good times. And quietly, he placed a small blue star in the logo, the same star she used to draw in notebooks when they dreamed together. It was his way of saying, "It's still here." Even when no one sees, the brother never came back. He tried to restart far away, with a new identity, new circles. But inside him, something remained stuck in time. Because those who don't learn from their mistakes only change the scenery. They repeat the plot. She continued writing. Books, letters, phrases on napkins. He kept expanding his empire. But everything they built now had a different name, purpose. Because they understood, each in their own way, that nothing is worthwhile if it can't be shared with someone who knows you completely. On the anniversary of their first kiss, without planning it, they both showed up at the same park. They laughed, sat on the same bench, ate the same ice cream, and without saying a word, they relived that feeling that some encounters are not marked by date, they're marked by soul. She, now more woman than ever, no longer sought answers, only stories. And he, more man than before, no longer looked for endings, just paths. And the two, walking side by side, knew that nothing else needed to be said. A few months later, she received a letter from him, handwritten, with only 3 sentences. "You changed my destiny. Thank you for not giving up on yourself." Because that's how I started believing in myself again. She read it, took a deep breath, kept it, and continued her life. Because when love is real, it doesn't imprison, it sets free. Today, the two continue existing in the same world, but with independent, conscious, and mature lives. When they meet, they look at each other with the calm of those who know the essential has already been lived, and that whatever comes next will be a gift. Because love that survives time, betrayal, pride, and silence doesn't need endings. It only needs to be respected. And you, who made it this far, need to understand, what destroys a story is not the mistake, it's the inability to restart with truth. If this story touched you, share it, comment, tell someone. Maybe someone beside you also needs to learn that love isn't about perfection. It's about reconstruction. Subscribe, turn on the notification bell, leave your like, and help us keep creating stories that touch the heart, because this is your free Dorama channel here on YouTube.